So I wanted to make this week's screencast about Chapter 2 and specifically some of the characteristics of international markets. Now, some of these may be positive, that is a reason why a company may choose to expand beyond its own borders and purchase goods from overseas and import them or export goods and sell them. But also some are factors to be aware of, increased risks that come from doing business overseas. And this small activity, I thought, in our e-textbook wasn't working for everyone, and it could have included more details. So I'm going to go through all of the reasons that international markets are different from domestic ones, and just talk about an example. So the first is just the reason to go international is market size. There are more people in the world than in your own country. Once you've sold to everyone in your city, you should expand to everyone in the province and everyone to the rest of the country. And then when you've exhausted all those possible consumers in Canada, look overseas. For example, Roots has been operating in Taiwan for about 20 years. It's a very, very popular store there. It has as many Taiwanese stores as it has Canadian stores. So instead of just settling for the 35 million Canadian customers, Roots decided it wanted to make more money to sell more. So, it expanded and has had great success in Asia. To be aware that there is greater diversity. There's just going to be cultural differences, some ad campaigns, might not work well. Some products may not suit everyone. You might have to change your offerings. For example, when McDonald's expanded to India, because beef is not consumed there, the Big Mac could no longer be a signature menu item. But so they created the Maharaja Mac, which was suited the customers there. For example, a parka company is not going to work everywhere in the world, but it might want to, make other clothing items in order to get access to those customers. So just be aware there's greater diversity, and that makes the international business more complicated. It just becomes more complex. If you recall, Target expanded into Canada. It's a big U.S. chain, but in Canada it has had trouble stocking the stores, and there were many, many empty shelves. People would go to the Target store and they couldn't purchase their items. So that'd be very, very frustrating for a retail experience. So, just distribution. In the U.S., the cities are very, very close together. So you could have a hub and, it could easily reach several cities. With Canada, the population spread out more along the southern border. So perhaps, your transportation costs and you're just more complicated. It's more expensive. And Target just had trouble getting goods to the stores in Canada, and as a result, it failed. There's just going to be some differences, some unfamiliarity, different technologies, different standards. For example, cars might have different emission standards from one country to another. A big one is accounting. Throughout the world, we use international financial reporting standards, but the U.S. uses GAAP, generally accepted accounting principles. There's some similarities, but it means that, for any financial, actuarial, any auditor, any accountant who must do business with the U.S., they have to change what they're doing to meet the new standards in the U.S. So there just might be some little differences that require an adjustment. The currency exchange, so we're buying goods in another currency, and that's another variable. What is the Canada and the U.S. exchange rate? That's going to, affect how much we can export to the U.S., and businesses are not totally in control of that. That might be something that's unanticipated. Their sales might be in another currency, and then the value of those sales could go down, when converted back into Canadian dollars, or their expenses, which could be in another currency, like salaries or their production costs or transportations, those could go up depending on how the exchange rate goes. For example, 90% of New Brunswick's manufacturing businesses are exported into the U.S. So if the value of the U.S. dollar falls, that is, Canadian goods become more expensive, U.S. companies will choose not to buy New Brunswick goods. And then New Brunswick, it's so much of their manufacturing sector, 90%, these little currency fluctuations can make a big difference. So, maybe the value of the US dollar falls a little bit. Somebody chooses to substitute a local producer for Canadian imports, and then people in New Brunswick are laid off because of exchange rate changes. So also it's the business cycle. It's hard to understand, the business cycle in the first place because it involves everyone in the economy. But then when you consider another country, for example, people are having trouble predicting what Donald Trump will do next. So will he, stimulate the stock market? Will he put, tariffs? Will he, make an announcement that changes the business cycle? Will his announcement increase jobs and cause an expansion, which would be good for the U.S. business cycle? Or will it, cause uncertainty and perhaps a recession? So it's one thing to consider is the business cycle. You might not be able to properly predict what happens in the business cycle for another country. A major reason that countries operate overseas is for cost savings. For example, an automotive company might move a factory to Mexico because wages in Mexico are lower than they are in Canada. Many clothing goods, if you were to check the label, you might see that they're made overseas. Here is a clothing factory in Myanmar. You'll see that they're made overseas because of the lower labor costs, and that allows them to, fast fashion companies to charge less to their consumers. So we get lower prices because of international business. And, on the next slide, there's what's called an export processing zone. And these are these big ports, that include factories, and they're technically not part of that own country. They're not a part of India, or they're not a part of Bangladesh. They're kind of this, gray area, so that they can easily be exported with less regulation. And many clothing companies will be located in these EPZs or export processing zones in order to, lower their costs. The supply chain, how do the goods go from their initial raw materials to the first stages of production, to producing the goods in process, to the finalized goods, to the consumers? How is that going to work out? And, it just becomes more complicated. There are longer transportation trips. You might have to cross the ocean on a super tanker. There might be delays at the borders. It's just, the supply chain might lower the cost, but it is, more challenging and more complicated. Trade barriers, that could include something like tariffs, which is basically a tax on imported goods. You might have heard of Donald Trump raising tariffs on China. And, it could be quotas, a limit on how much Canadian lumber can be imported into the United States. There's kind of other barriers just that might, make it more complicated to trade, permits, regulation, other things that make it more difficult to change. So these barriers are something you might consider. Market research, it's hard to understand the tastes of another country. They might be different than yours. On the map here are all the locations of a Tim Hortons restaurant, and you can see, where they're located through Canada, and, they're definitely, pretty strong in Quebec and Ontario, but they're really only in the northeast of the United States, because even though it's close, it's just the tastes in the south of the U.S., in the Midwest, in California, it just doesn't seem to be working for them. So they've had some success, in New York, but not so much in New England, because Dunkin' Donuts seems to be a little stronger. And they've had some success, in, the Pennsylvanias and the Ohios, but it's been harder for them to understand the American consumer. The American consumer is similar, but not always the same. So with market research, companies will often pick, a country that's similar to their own as the first export, destination, and then you go from there. Risk management is just more uncertain. Over the weekend, there was a drone strike in Saudi Arabia as a result of the Saudi Arabia and Yemen conflict, and it disrupted about 5% of the world's oil supply. So if you were depending on Saudi Arabia oil, you have no idea what might be happening there. A climate, a hurricane, global warming, a forest fire, that is a risk when you go outside your traditional area. Social risks, for example, in Hong Kong, the protests that will be disrupting the market there. So, there's just, as you go worldwide and become an international business, there's just as greater risks that you need to be aware of. So we also have expert employees, meaning that you have access to the talent pool around the world. So if you want to get a CEO from San Francisco to head your Canadian tech startup, you can. I have a picture of Bay Street here because financial services are one of Canada's biggest exports. Not any kind of good or anything that's a product that's, you can hold, just financial services and expertise are something that Canadians export around the world. So they have extra opportunities in the financial services because they can export their advice around the world. And Canada might have a program called the Global High Skills Visa Program in order to facilitate expert employees coming to Canada and contributing. So I think that it's key to understand from this chapter, how a domestic market, that is, making the good in Toronto, selling it to Toronto citizens, staying in Canada, is different from an international business. And some of these points here in this screencast are the key learning points for this activity, this chapter. Thank you.